Hello, this is Enraged Eggplant, and you are watching not only the parts you need, and not a Doom video. This is just a side thing. I have extracted all the covers of all GURPS books, and I'm going to rate them, make a tier list. Do not take this very seriously. I mostly rate them from the position of what games I play and how useful the books are to me personally. Things might be different for you. This is GURPS after all. Let's start alphabetically, but the alphabet actually starts here. Action 1, Heroes. So I do not play action games. I can see this book being useful to other people, so I'll put it in tier C. Action 2, Exploits. Now, this much more useful book, because despite being an action book, it provides many cinematic rules that can be used in other kinds of games, especially the chase rules. I use it sometimes. This is a solid book, so I'll put it in tier B. Action 3, Furious Fists. This is a very specialized thing. I'll put it in tier C, along with Action 4 Specialists. But Action 5, Dictionary of Danger, is very interesting. It provides you a list of various environmental dangers and improvised weapons and all that. It can be useful outside of the action genre. Action 6, Tricked Out Rides. Tier C. Even though this is technically a vehicle book. In my games, vehicles usually are more of a plot device. But if I ever play a modern TL game where vehicles are centerpieces of the game, I'll definitely use this one. Action 7, Mercenaries, tier C. Even though it has a nice mercenary system at the end. This is a very short book. Along with Action 6, it was in the 2020 PDF challenge. Then adaptations. I'll put it in tier B. This is a very solid book. People who want to adapt some already published settings, games, or whatever to GURPS should read it. But you probably know that I usually play just D&D, Pathfinder, and I know how to adapt things for myself. But I appreciate the existence of this book. Aliens, Spirals. D. Even though this is a, I guess, nice template of an alien species description, it does not really provide me with anything that I would use in a sci-fi game. What I remember about this book is that it has a new psionic ability. I think clairosomnia, something like that, that allows you to displace your sense of smell. So it can be useful for certain types of games when you do not want to imagine the smell, but you want to actually smell it. GURPS Alphabet Arcane Lost Serifs Tier D along with the Alphabet Arcane. This is not my thing. After the End, Wastelanders. This is also Tier D for me. I'm not that into post-apocalyptic games. After the End 2, on the other hand, has some neat stuff about environments, radiation, especially weird cinematic radiation. It's cool. So I'll put it in Tier D. Backdrops, the Tower of Octavius. Who cares? Brainstorm, Abydos or Abydos, I don't know. I am not sure. D or C, probably C. It can be used in your other fantasy games to describe a necromantic society. It's very edgy. Here's Brainstorm, C. Even though the setting is, I guess it's interesting, even though I wouldn't play in it, probably. It has some nice racial templates. It can be useful, even if you are not playing Brainstorm. GURPS basic set, of course, it's Tier S. And now we return to the proper alphabet. Big Lizzie, Tier D. Biotech, Tier A. This is a very interesting book. Even if you are not planning to use any biotech, it is a very entertaining read. You can learn a lot from it, unironically. It's probably even A+ or S-. And if you like cat girls, it's an S tier for you. Boardroom and Curia. I haven't really used it, but I've heard good things about it. If your game is all about organizations, I'll put it in Tier B. Boardroom and Curia, Tomorrow Rides, D. Caravan to Ain Aris. This is a so-called entry-level adventure in GURPS. Actually, I haven't even read it, but I don't plan to. GURPS Casey and Andy. City Stats. This is a decent short supplement, but it's not essential by all means. I'll put it in Tier C. GURPS Combat Cards. D. I can see why they can be useful for new players when you play in person. I haven't really played GURPS in person, only online. Creatures of the Night. All 5 books go in Tier D. They just describe some creatures, I think 6 or 10 in each book, how to use them, but I haven't really found them that interesting. But maybe you will. GURPS Crusades. C. Dungeon Fantasy Career Guide 2020 edition. This is basically just a list of occupational templates for Dungeon Fantasy, lenses and all that. I'll put it in D. Even though this is really useful if you are playing a Dungeon Fantasy game, but I'm not playing Dungeon Fantasy. Dungeon Fantasy Denizens Barbarians. B. This is a great book. It allows you to expand the concept of a barbarian or a berserker a lot. It provides new limitations for the berserk disadvantage to make it less suicidal think it's Enraged -50% that allows you to use committed attacks instead of all-out attacks. And also has some nice pre-built abilities, the Rage Power modifier. It's very good. Not an A tier, but it's solid. The same can be said about Swordbucklers. It has a lot of pre-built abilities. Dungeon fantasy setting, Cavern Town. You would expect me to put it in tier D, but it is actually tier C. I am not very interested in the setting material that is provided there, but there are some nice rules about where availability. If you are planning to buy something rare, you can devise a modifier, roll against it, and see if it can be bought in this settlement or not. This is cool, I think. On the other hand, dungeon fantasy setting called Shard Mountains does not give me anything like that. Dungeon fantasy adventurers. This is basically just occupational templates. I do not use them. I can see why they can be useful. Tier D. What is this? Dungeon Fantasy 10 Taverns D. Dungeon Fantasy 11 Power Up. This is actually tier B. There's a lot of interesting ability builds that you can use even outside of the Dungeon Fantasy line. Dungeon Fantasy 12 Ninja. This is difficult. It's probably C- or D+. Let's put it into C tier, because I like ninjas. There's some ninja-related gear in this book that I like. Dungeon Fantasy 13 Loadouts. This tier C. It is useful outside of the Dungeon Fantasy line because it gives you loadouts for adventurers. Dungeon Fantasy 14 Psy. I'm not a fan of how Dungeon Fantasy treats psionics. I'll put it into D tier. And henchmen too. On the other hand, Dungeon Fantasy 16 Wilderness Adventures is a tier A book. I don't know why it is in the DF line. It is very good. If you are concerned with camping, traveling, and all that stuff, foraging, hunting, buy well worth its price. Dungeon Fantasy 17 Guilds. You have Boardroom and Courier, so it's a D tier. Dungeon Fantasy 18 Power Items D. Dungeon Fantasy 19 Incantation Magic D. You know, I'm not a big fan of ritual path magic, but incantation magic is a step up from that. Dungeon Fantasy 2 Dungeons. This is a tier A book because it describes a lot of rules concerning various environments and obstacles you can find in the dungeons. It can be useful even outside of the Dungeon Fantasy line. What is this? Dungeon Fantasy 20 Slayers. This is actually a cool book. It has some nice perks and new advantages that can be used outside of the Dungeon Fantasy line. I'm probably sounding like a broken record. Dungeon Fantasy 21 Mega Dungeons, Tier C. If you are into Mega Dungeons, read this book. It provides you with great advice, but nothing in terms of mechanics. And I like mechanics. Dungeon Fantasy 3, the next level. C. There are new racial templates, some power-ups, but nothing really extraordinarily. Dungeon Fantasy 4, Sages, Tier C. There's some stuff about books, scrolls, research that again can be used outside of the Dungeon Fantasy line. Dungeon Fantasy 5 Allies gives you some rules about familiars, and this is always nice. If you want to know more about familiars, you can check out, I think, Pyramid 75. There's an article written by Christopher R. Rice called The Familiar Path. It's very cool. Dungeon Fantasy 6 40 Artifacts, Tier D. Dungeon Fantasy 7 Clerics. Even if you are not using vanilla magic, this can be useful to you if you are making a priestly character and not sure what kind of powers, what kind of spells you should give to him. Dungeon Fantasy 8 Treasure Tables. This is a solid Tier A. Can be used even outside of the Dungeon Fantasy line, has a lot of new stuff. It's just a great book. Dungeon Fantasy 9 Summoners. Probably Tier C, or maybe C-. There's some stuff about minion hordes, summoning, the conjured, plus 100% modifier for allies. It's nice. Dungeon Fantasy Adventure 1 Mirror of the Fire Demon, Tier D. I'm not interested in pre-written adventures, but this book can be useful to you regardless of that, because in the end there is some example random encounter tables that you can butcher. Dungeon Fantasy Adventure 2 Tomb of the Dragon King, Tier D. Dungeon Adventure 3, I cannot read the title, something about Deep Night and the Stars, Tier D. Dungeon Fantasy Encounters, all three of them go into Tier D. Dungeon Fantasy Monsters go to Tier C. It's a nice bestiary. Dungeon Fantasy Monsters 2 goes to Tier C as well, and 3 and 4. The second book covers slimes, oozes, and all that. It can be useful, because sometimes you are not sure, should the slime be homogeneous, should be diffuse, and all that. This one gives you some mythical monsters such as manticores, medusas, and dragons are always cool. I didn't like the 5th book about demons. It was released last week, or not very interesting in my opinion. Maybe just because I'm used to the Dungeons and Dragons demons, it can be more useful to you. Dungeon Fantasy Treasures 3 Artifacts of Fell Tower. No. Legend Fantasy Treasures 1, Glittering Prizes. This is I don't know, maybe even a B- or a C+ book. It's all about coins. It's very interesting. I really didn't expect it to be. It was a good surprise. Dungeon Fantasy Treasures 2, Epic Treasures. No. The only interesting thing I remember about it are rules for weapons and armor made of gold and platinum. Impractical but cool. Dungeon Fantasy Treasures 4, Mixed Blessings. I had mixed feelings about it. Disasters, Hurricane. I think it's a tier C book. I remember I haven't really read it that much. I can see it being useful. I just remember that after its release on the forums there were a lot of arguments about it. That people did not like the dexterity penalties for wind, didn't like the new search and rescue skill. I don't know. Disasters, meltdown and fallout. Tier C. If you are into radiation, it's cool. Discworld. I heard that it's a very good book. I haven't really read it. It has a new magic system that is flexible, but I have some gripes with most flexible systems. I'll put it into tier D just because I'm not interested in Discworld. I have the actual novels somewhere here, probably in some box, or I really need to buy a bookshelf. I have nowhere to put my books in. GURPS Dragons. This is more like 3.5 edition book, and it's a good read. Not very useful in terms of mechanics, but good nonetheless. What is this? GURPS Encounter the Hearts Club. No. GURPS Fantasy Portal Realms. This genre of fantasy is not my thing. But if it's your thing, then you should give it a read. It gives you some details on how to treat such traits as wealth, reputation, status on traveling between worlds. So it can be very useful. GURPS Fantasy Tech 1, The Age of Reality. It wasn't very useful to me. On the other hand, GURPS Fantasy Tech 2 goes into tier B, I mean tier C. It has some cool stuff like double-ended weapons, double swords, demonic whips. It's just great. GURPS Fantasy. It's a great world-building book. And also it has some new mechanical stuff like what? Some new modifiers for advantage, new skill specialties. And I think this is the only book that has anything about chariots. I don't think I have seen anything about chariots in low tech. It's all in fantasy. Or maybe I am misremembering things. GURPS Furries. This is actually a tier B book. It has some nice things for not only for the so-called furries or beastmen, beastfolk, but also for normal animals. It has a lot of racial templates, new perks, new features, new techniques, especially the clawed grapple technique. This is good. GURPS GM Screen. As I said, I haven't played GURPS in person. GURPS Gun Fu. Probably tier C, even though I do not really use it. It does have some rules that I use in some of my sorcery spells. I think that the rules that transfer damage to disarming rolls. So if you have to, for example, use a gun to disarm a person at range, check out Gun Fu. GURPS Horror Beyond the Pale. This is honestly probably the worst book for the 2020 PDF challenge. It just does not work as an adventure at all. If you want to know more details, you can read a review of it written by Mylanka on his blog. GURPS Horror Madness Dossier. This is a tier B book. Even though I'll probably never play in this setting, but it's a very entertaining read. I enjoyed it a lot. There's not that much mechanical stuff, I mean new mechanical stuff. There is some rules about possessing spirits, such as the law, but other than that, it's mostly the flavor, but the flavor is superb. GURPS Horror. This is another extremely well-written book. It has a lot of new mechanical stuff about panic attacks, corruption, new modifiers for leech, a lot of templates that can be used as is or just as a base for your own templates. It's good. Hotspots Constantinople, Renaissance Florence, Renaissance Venice, the Incense Trail, the Silk Road. I do not really play historical games. On the other hand, the last two books, the Incense Trail and the Silk Road, were interesting reads. I learned a lot. GURPS High Tech Adventure Guns. Sure, why not? GURPS High Tech Electricity and Electronics. Probably even tier B. I haven't really used it, but it's good. High Tech Pulp Guns Volume 1 and Volume 2. Probably tier B. GURPS High Tech Weapon Tables. I mean, this is tier C. GURPS High Tech Weapon Tables. I'll put it into tier C. And GURPS High Tech. This is a tier A book. Even though this is the one that I use the least from the tech books, but I really recommend it. It's extremely well written and researched. Even if you do not play any high-tech games, just give it a read, it's good. How to be a GURPS GM, Manage Expectations. This is a very new book. It was released like, I think less than a month ago, and it's a tier A book. Really, just give it a read. It answers a lot of questions that you sometimes see asked and just do not bother answering because this is just silly. People misunderstand a lot of stuff. Give it a read. Buy it. How to be a GURPS GM Ritual Path Magic tier D, and how to be a GURPS GM, it's a tier A book. It's basically your GM guide. It's mostly useful for new GMs. But even if you are experienced, you can find some useful pointers that you can show to your players, like what each level of an attribute means and all that. Infinite Worlds Britannica 6 D, Infinite Worlds Collegio January Tier D. I actually missed a very specific spell from it that I should convert someday to sorcery. Infinite Worlds IST. That's probably good if you are into supers but do not have any settings in mind. Infinite Worlds Lost Worlds, Infinite Worlds Worlds of Horror, and Infinite Worlds itself goes into A tier. I really like Infinite Worlds. I think the book is very well written, the setting is very interesting, even though it's a kitchen sink, but I like kitchen sinks. And I recommend reading it. Later the Fat Man. No. Lens Out of Time. This is a tier C book. It's I have seen people being interested in TL0 games, and this is basically one of the few resources that they have. GURPS Lite. It's probably a tier C book, maybe even D+. I do not like GURPS Lite. I think that you should not recommend it for starting players. It's like let's show somebody how good GURPS is, but remove everything good about it. It's just bare bones, roll 3d6 under something with no wide varieties of options, no huge lists of advantage skills. The very things I like GURPS for. I don't think it's a good idea to recommend GURPS Lite for new players. It's probably a hot take. What is this? Loadouts, low-tech armor. This is probably useful for historical games that aim for realism. So not really for me. Loadouts, Monster Hunters. Location, Hell's Gate, Tier D, Metro of Madness. There's actually some spells here that are quite cool. I forgot to convert them into sorcery. I have to take a note. Locations Warming Hall. This is a tier C book. Even if you are not planning to use the Warming Hall itself, it gives you a good guideline for how to make a magical university or something like that. Low-tech instant armor. This is a tier A book. It allows you to skip a lot of calculations. On the other hand, nowadays you have a GURPS character sheet, as in the software does basically the same thing, but it's cool to have the tables nonetheless. GURPS Low-Tech Companion 1, Philosophers and Kings. This is a tier C book. No, it's actually tier B. It details a lot of day-to-day stuff for high-class societies in the low-tech games about medicine, music, and all. It's cool, but probably for me it was the least useful of the low-tech companions. Low-tech companion 2, Weapons and Warriors. This is a tier A book. It's great. It allows you to customize weapons, armor, has a lot of new rules for size, scaling, damage to armor, damage to weapons, has a lot of new pre-written, I think, canons. And the first chapter of the book is basically a brief history of warfare. It's an extremely interesting read. I recommend it. Low Tech 3 is probably B plus or A minus. I'll put it here. It's more about the day-to-day stuff, building, transportation. It's useful, but not as useful as LTC2. Low Tech itself is, I don't know, it's probably S minus or A plus. It's very, very good. I should learn some new adjectives. Martial arts, fair-bearing combat, something. Well, I do not really use this style, and I do not play. I didn't. Oh, I do play the historical games sometimes. Not very historical. I mean the modern time games. It has some new techniques and perks that can be useful, like the nutcracker technique. So if you want to grab both of these nuts, get this book. Martial Arts Gladiators. This is tier B. Has a lot of new stuff, like presenting only your right or left side to the opponent, and new templates, new martial styles. It's cool. And what is this? Martial arts. This is technical grappling, I think. If it is, then it's tier C. Technical grappling is a very interesting book. It is extremely detailed, but I haven't played with it. I did play some test combats. Technical grappling feels way too complex for me. It's hard to wrap your head around it. I prefer using either basic set grappling or fantastic dungeon grappling. That is basically technical grappling, but streamlined. And this is a martial arts technique cheat sheet. It's a tier D. And this is martial arts ears fighting style. Even if you are not playing Brainstorm, this is a great book. It has some fantasy martial styles, some new advantages such as terrain adaptation underwater, and some other underwater rules. Not all of them, but more than you have. I think that basically it's a short version of that article from Pyramid 326, 24. MacGuffin Alphabet Tier C. Magic Artillery Spells. If you are playing with vanilla magic, it's a Tier C. Also Death Spells, Land Spells, Spell Charts. It's very good. It's free. Is it? I think it's free. GURPS Magic, the list of spells. I really like all these books, but especially I like the list of spells and land spells. There's some stuff for advantages here as well. GURPS Magical Styles Dungeon Magic. This is an interesting book as well. You can adapt these magical styles to powers if you want. And horror magic as well. GURPS Magic goes to Tier C. I have a soft spot for vanilla magic, but it doesn't really work that well in play, in my opinion. But I really like the concept. GURPS Martial Arts. It's a Tier S book. If you think different, why do you hate fun? GURPS combat is probably the best combat in all the RPGs I've seen, and GURPS Martial Arts makes it much better. This is just no contest. Regardless of the genre, this is great. Even if you do not play a combat heavy book, or even if you do not play GURPS at all, this is a very interesting read about history of martial arts, development, all kinds of them. One of my favorites. GURPS Mars Attacks, get out of here. GURPS Mass Combat. Probably B. It's not perfect, but it's probably one of the best mass combat systems that I have seen. I do have some gripes with GURPS Mass Combat, but like determining what exact units have you lost after combat resolves. But other than that, I am more than content with it. Monster Hunters Encounters 1, don't care. On the other hand, Monster Hunters Power-Ups 1, this is a Tier B book. Even if you are not playing Monster Hunters, it has some nice pre-built abilities, like this is the book where you can find a modifier for extra attack that allows you to use an extra ready maneuver. A lot of people ask about it, but they do not know where to find it. And it also has Metatronic generators from GURPS Pyramid 46. Monster Hunter Champions, no. Monster Hunters 2, the mission, it's probably more useful. It has some stuff on research, location. GURPS Monster Hunter 3, the enemy. Sidekicks, applied xenology, holy hunters all go into Tier D. And GURPS Mysteries. This is, I don't know, A, or it's probably a Tier A book for people who run games about investigation, but for me it's a Tier B. It's a good read. It's a very solid book. I've heard recommendations to read this book even if you are running games other than GURPS that focus on investigations. GURPS powers divine favor. This is probably tier B. This is an example of magic as powers. It has some interesting pre-built advantages, but I do not use divine favor as it is in my games. I do not like how it is based around the patron advantage, but I appreciate its existence. GURPS powers enhanced senses. It's a tier A book. Yes, not even B. I really like this one. It consolidates a lot of information about the senses, how they are categorized, how to change them, enhance, limit them. There's a lot of pre-written abilities that can be slightly adjusted if you do not like them. This is some top-notch GURPS content. GURPS powers the weird. It's probably an A book as well. I do have a particular player who likes such concepts as I want to play a brain in a jar, I want to play a 4-dimensional centaur. It's great. There are some questionable stuff in there, but still it's tier A, maybe A-. GURPS powers, totems and nature spirits. I didn't really like this one. I don't know, it felt kind of bland, but the only thing I remember is the soaring enhancement for enhanced move that for some reason cannot be really used if you do not have enhanced move, even though it seems that it should be. And the area perception enhancement for clairsentience. It's expensive but very interesting. And GURPS powers. This goes into tier C because you know, some people treat this book just as an extension of the basic set that gives you more advantages, more enhancement and limitations, but GURPS powers is much more deep and involved than that. A lot of people fail to realize that. And then they start asking some silly questions about advantages or powers. And the only answer is read the book. It's that easy. Probably applies to most of the questions. Just read the book. GURPS Prime Directive, tier D for me. GURPS SciTech. This is tier A. It's very cool for your either high-tech or ultra-tech games, but there is some stuff that can be adapted to low-tech games as well. And it updates PsyTech from GURPS Ultratech. Psionic Campaigns. It's also a tier A book. It gives a lot of advice on how to run games with psionics, how to run it without psionics short-circuiting your adventures, and it can be useful even for non-psionic games, because a lot of powers accomplish the same things. It's useful. GURPS Psionic Powers is a tier A book. Even if it is just an application of powers, it's just extremely well written. I don't really have anything to add. This is very good stuff. GURPS Psis or Psis. D. I don't like that one. GURPS Power-Ups 1 Embedments. This is probably tier B. It is useful. It has some problems, but it is the only way to do some things. Power-Ups 2 Perks. Tier A. It's good. Power-Up 3 Talents. Probably tier A as well. Power-Up 4 Enhancements. Tier S. Yes, it doesn't have that much new stuff, but it collects a lot of generic enhancement from other books and consolidates them in one book. It has some interesting new stuff about the cosmic enhancements, how to use them without breaking the game and all that. Power-Ups 5 Impulse Buys. Probably tier C. I do not really like meta currencies, but Impulse Buys has some interesting things on spending character points to affect the world. For example, to make effects permanent and all that. So it can be used even if you are not using any other kinds of meta currencies. Power-Up 6 Quirks. Tier A. It is not just a list of published quirks, it provides a lot of guidelines on how to create new ones. It's very good. Power-Up 7 Wildcard Skills. I don't use those. Power-Ups 8 Limitations. Tier S. Again, this is mostly just consolidations of all previously published limitations in a single volume. And it also has a reduced duration limitation that is nowhere to be found. Well, it could be found in the GURPS FAQ, but it was never published. Why? Just why? Power-Ups 9 Alternate Attributes. This is probably an A+. It's it addresses a lot of questions about the basic mechanics of GURPS and offers you multiple different ways of how to handle them, how to adjust them to your particular game. It's maybe an S. No, let's keep it in the A tier. GURPS Range Ruler. It's a tier D for me. I haven't played GURPS in person. GURPS Realm Management. It's probably a tier B for me. I am very interested in the concept of realm management. I have read a lot of realm management systems for Dungeons and Dragons, Pathfinder, and some other systems, and none of them were satisfying. Realm management is, in my opinion, one of the best ones. It has some problems, but it's tier B. Reign of Steel, Read the Sky. This is an adventure. Reign of Steel, Will to Live. If you need robot templates, use this book as a base. Also, it has a new enhancement for damage reduction. Or damage resistance? Yes, damage resistance. For laminate armor. Social engineering, back to school. This is tier A. I really like the learning mechanics, learning and teaching and studying. Social engineering, keeping in contact. This is a good book, but it's a tier B for me. It was less useful, along with social engineering pulling rank. SEALs in Vietnam, D. Social engineering itself is a tier A book, probably A+, S-. It just read it. GURPS skill categories. This is actually probably tier B. This is a free document, I think, that you can get on the SJ Games website. It's useful, especially when you are making occupational templates. GURPS sorcery, protection and warning spells. It has some neat stuff, but it's a tier B for me. GURPS sorcery, sound spells. Of course it's tier S, I wrote this book. But no, it's tier B. It has some interesting janky spell builds. But other than that, I don't know. GURPS Space, Planetary, Record and Worksheet. D. GURPS Space goes into tier A. It's a very extensive book about space world building. Also, alien life form generator is very cool. On the other hand, I've heard some stuff about the star system and planet building data being outdated. I don't know, I'm not an astrophysicist. GURPS spaceships, the entire series goes into tier D. I do not like how GURPS treats spaceships. GURPS steampunk setting, the broken clockwork world. D. GURPS steampunk 1, settings and style. I'll give it a C just because it knows what steampunk is. It's not just gears. I'm not a fan of steampunk, but I'll just give it a C. I'll give a second volume, Steam and Shellfire, a C as well. I hope you do not hear this creaking on my chair. And Steampunk 3, Soldiers and Scientists go into tier D. GURPS Supers. It's actually a tier A book. It doesn't look like it at the first sight, but it is. It has some new advantages, new modifiers, new skills, and provides a lot of good guidelines on how to run high-powered or low-powered supers games. It's good, even outside of the supers genre. Supporting cast, Age of Sail Pirate Crew, D. Tactical shooting, A. This is also a very interesting read even if you do not play firearms. I think some of this stuff can be applied to crossbows and bows as well, so give it a read. Tales of the Solar Patrol. I grew up reading Heinlein's juvenile novels, so I'll give it a C just because of that. Otherwise, it probably would have gone into tier D. It has a new disadvantage, the last stand. GURPS Thaumatology, Age of Gold D, Alchemical Baroque D, Chinese Elemental Powers B. This is an interesting little volume that is just another application of powers. It's cool. Here's Thaumatology Magical Styles. This is probably tier B, even though I am not using vanilla magic. Some of the perks can be applied to powers as well. GURPS Ritual Path Magic. You know, when this book first released, I thought that is the best thing ever. But when I played with it, it gave me a PTSD. GURPS Thaumatology Sorcery. I would actually put it into tier D. I mean tier B. But it also has an enchanting system that allows you to price magic items even if you do not really use the enchanting itself, or if you do not like how the Metatronic generators handle that. So I'll give it A, maybe A minus, B plus. Other than that, it's actually nothing really new. It's just an application of powers. You expected me to give it an S because I like sorcery this much. You are wrong. I think the only new thing it has is some edge case rules for alternative abilities, when you can maintain two instances of the same abilities, but you have to switch with a ready maneuver every time. And it has a very questionable rule about the size modifier of the target. I do not even use it, because it doesn't really make sense sometimes. I have written a post on SJ Games forums about it, and people seem to agree with me. So it's probably between A and B. Here's Thaumatology Urban Magics. This is probably B plus. Even if you are not using vanilla magic, it describes how magic can affect city life. GURPS Thaumatology itself goes into tier A. It may be even A plus or S minus. This is very good. If you want to make your own magic system, look no further. Right. Transhuman Space Biotech 2100. This is tier B. This book describes how biotechnology can affect this setting. How, for example, people and laws can treat bioroids, uplifted animals, and all that. It is very useful even outside of the transhuman space setting. Transhuman space, bioroid bazaar, same thing. Transhuman space, changing times. Well, probably put it into tier C, because this is an adaptation of the 3rd edition Transhuman Space to the 4th edition. It does have some new mechanics, also has a new guns specialty for wrist guns, or mounted shoulder pods, reactional rifles. You know, I'll keep it in C. Transhuman Space Cities on the Edge. It's a tier B book. Again, even outside the transhuman space setting, it describes how ultra-tech cities work. It's good. Transhuman Space Martial Arts 2100, same thing. Transhuman Space Personnel Files, all of them go into tier D. Shell Tech, probably tier C, not B. It can be useful outside transhuman space, but not that much. Transhuman Space Terra Logos News, all 4 of them go into tier D. And Transhuman Mysteries goes into tier B. It's all about mysteries, but in an ultra-tech setting. Really, you should give it a read if you're planning on making an ultra-tech investigation game. Transhuman Space Wings of the Rising Sun go into tier D. Right. Traveler Interstellar Wars, tier D. I'm not very interested in the setting, but I know that this book has an alternative take on spaceship combat. Maybe it's better than the spaceships. I know that they are different, but I haven't really read it. Combat counters, the psionics institutes go into tier D. Now template toolkit 1 characters, tier D. I have never used it. I do not use occupational templates. Template toolkit 2 races, on the other hand, goes into tier A. It's a very good volume. It's densely packed with all the info you need for racial template creation. And it even has some new features, perks, quirks, advantages, and somewhat remade alien life form generation thing from GURPS space, but only partially. GURPS template toolkit 3 Starship Crew. I would put it into tier D, but I'll give it a C. It can be useful just to see what skills what spaceship crewmen should have. GURPS Ultralight, this is just a meme. Underground Adventures, on the other hand, goes into tier A. It has rules for illumination, hearing underground, squeezing through tight spaces, fighting in confined spaces. It's very good. GURPS update. Well, if you want to update 3rd edition stuff, get it, it's for free. It's free, I mean. Ultra-tech weapon tables. I'll give it a what? A B. It's useful reference. And GURPS Ultra-tech, I know that people hate it. I'll give it a. A lot of people, I think, do not really understand how to use Ultra-tech. It's not supposed to be a gear catalog for you to pick stuff. It's more of a it's more of a world building book in my opinion. You really have to pick things carefully, what exists in your setting, what does not. Think about the implications, about the interactions between some technologies. Do not use it blindly. And yes, it could have been edited better. There's anytime I play an Ultratech game, some issue pops up. GURPS vehicles, steampunk conveyances, D. GURPS vehicles, transports on fantasy, C. It has some low-tech transports that are not really fantastic, so it can be useful if you are running a historical game. GURPS or Kosigan Saga, D. I haven't read the novels. I have them somewhere in my apartment, but I have not read them. I remember my grandmother telling me that Warkosigan Saga reads very differently from other military science fiction novels because it was written by a woman. But she was giving positive feedback about this novel series. I do not know the quality of the GURPS book. Zombies Day 1 is tier D, but zombies themselves go into tier B. This book covers some nice mechanical stuff like temperature tolerance, radiation tolerance, coupled with immunity to metabolic hazards, and that can be confusing. So, we're done. You now know my tastes. Some of you probably now hate me. But anyway, do not take this seriously. This is just my opinion. And feel free to comment and tell me what you think about it. See you!